O1A vacuum tube part 2. So in the first part, what I did was ran 5 volts to the cathode and got the heater going, which you saw. I turn on this power supply, which needs to be reset sometimes. Cathode / heater is on. Then what I did was hooked a second power supply to the grid of the tube so that I can modulate the grid voltage, which ultimately affects the output across the plate. Which was really cool. So I've never done this before, but I've always, read, this is the simple vacuum tube mechanics that I've read about all these years. So I have exactly 5 volts across the cathode, and really interesting thing happens, which any radio guy would know, but when I turn up the plate grid voltage from the other power supply, the flow across the tube from the cathode to the plate goes to 0 volts. And I'd show you this with the multimeter, but it's hard to hold all this. So what's going on here? Well, you've heard the basic laws of electricity that Benjamin Franklin discovered, that like charges repel, opposites attract. And you have positive and negative charge. And what happens in a vacuum tube is when you have your cathode lit up, which is what you see here, the cathode is basically like the little filament in a light bulb, but it's emitting electrons, and those electrons are flowing across the vacuum inside this tube. They want to go to the plate, and from the plate to ground, because electricity is always trying to find its way to ground. So, but in between the source of the electron flow, which is positive, and the plate, which is negative, you have a grid, which is basically like a screen door. It's a little teeny wire screen. That grid is, well, right now, with this power supply turned down to 0 volts, is 0 volts. So, there is I don't know if this tube is working really great, but because I tried to test it, and it is from the 1920s, but I think that there should be 5 volts flowing from the cathode to the plate. The multimeter said somewhere between 5 and half a volt. I'll have to check that again. But if I increase the voltage on that power supply, I am increasingly making the plate positive. Now, what did we say? Like charges repel, opposites attract. So when you increase the positivity of the grid, you are cutting like a valve, like a water faucet. You are turning down the flow of electrons across the tube. Does that make sense? So by a tiny amount, some tubes run at thousands of volts, But by a tiny amount of electricity across the grid, I can control the flow of a lot of electricity across the whole tube. And so it essentially acts as a switch. But there's a lot of functions of tubes. There's switch diode, there's rectification, there's amplification, there's frequency generation, there's a lot of things that these things are used for. But this type of tube is really fun because you can see, if you were here sitting here, you can see the three elements very clearly, the cathode, grid, and plate. And they were the first commercially mass-produced tube. Before this tube, there were tubes, the DeForest Audion tubes were made in small batches, but this tube was made by the millions in factories, and even after essentially 100 years, it's still working. So that's O1A's Part 2 on Radio KAOS.